Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's World Affairs program. I'm Jamali. I'm a senior reporter at the public radio show Marketplace. Before coming to Marketplace, I was co-host and correspondent for KQED's The California Report, airing on NPR stations throughout the state. Today's program host, World Affairs, is a San Francisco-based nonprofit, nonpartisan forum that explores international issues and global ideas, highlighting practices and solutions to some of our most pressing challenges. Today, on Cyber Monday, in case you hadn't heard, one of the year's biggest days of sales and consumer spending, we're joined by Kathryn Judge, the Harvey J. Goldschmid Professor of Law. She's also the Vice Dean for Intellectual Life at Columbia Law School. She's an expert on banking, financial innovation, financial crises, and regulatory architecture. Kate's new book, Direct: The Rise of the Middleman Economy and the Power of Going to the Source, was on the long list for the FT newspaper's Business Book of the Year, among other accolades. Kate currently serves as the editor of the Journal of Financial Regulation and is a research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute. Welcome to you, Kate.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy to be here.
It's really great to have you. And before we dive in, a quick comment: there is going to be a Q&A at the end of this, so please come up with your questions and feel free to add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll make sure to get to as many of them at the end as we can. So Kate, I think we've learned more about supply chains in the last couple of years than most of us ever imagined we would, maybe more than most of us ever hoped that we would. And I wondered if you could begin by just asking what brought you to this area of research as somebody who came at it with a background in financial regulation.
Yeah, so it was interesting. It was really one of the first times that I found an incredible intersection between the work that I was doing and the daily life that I was leading. So much of my work has been on finance and financial regulation, and I really got to that in some ways motivated by life, but much more indirectly. We're just living through the 2007, 2008 financial crisis and seeing so many people laid off, and then learning about the uneven distributional consequences of the economic havoc wreaked by that crisis got me really interested in how it could go so wrong. So a lot of my work was like the power of these really large banks and their influence, but as you said, the supply chains. And at that point, it was really these securitization chains that really appeared to be making the whole economic system and financial system better off in the short run. You know, we saw housing go up, we saw the racial housing gap go down. But what we learned when the crisis hit is a lot of information was lost along the way. And so the book came about through these personal experiences where suddenly I was like shopping and I would be trying to figure out like where the nuts in my mixed nuts came from. And I realized like not only did I not know, but I couldn't figure it out. And so there was this weird, eerie recollection of, well, this was exactly what happened with securitization, where when we actually tried to get the information, we just couldn't. You know, we had all of these structures that seemed to make goods cheaper and more available, but we also lost a huge amount of information along the way. And so it was that process of understanding, well, what's the economic structure that leads to these situations where we seem to get more stuff, but once we need more information, either because things became shaky and we wanted to know more about, you know, the actual value of these financial instruments, or we're just a conscious consumer and we're really interested in kind of like, well, who's impacted and what are the places that are helping to feed my family? The information gaps that were produced by these complex chains started to intrigue me.
Absolutely. And with good reason. And as a reporter, one of my mottos these days is every story is a supply chain story. I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too, but talk to me about a trip that you took to a Walmart, I believe it was in New Jersey, that impacted, you know, your thinking about why this was an area you wanted to explore more. And, you know, I think the story actually underscores this stuff is very personal. Stuff in general is very personal to us. We remember where we got a lot of our stuff. We remember what we paid for a lot of stuff. But this particular trip that you took ended up really shaping your research for the next few years.
Yeah, I did. So, I mean, part of what's really interesting is I was out at a Walmart. I was staying out in Newton, New Jersey. I was actually staying at my aunt's country house. We had just had our second daughter, as we decided to try to escape from the city for a little while. And even though it was our second daughter, we still were kind of naive parents, and we're like, all right, we can leave the city, and we don't need that much stuff. We'll be fine. And then of course you get out there and you're like, oh no, like that extra pacifier we really needed. And that little like baby rocker, like we can do without it, but like she's a lot crankier than we expected without that little rocker. And so it's like, oh, I have to pick up some food anyways. So maybe I'll try and get a couple of additional baby items by doing my grocery shopping at Walmart. And while I didn't know it at a time, Walmart is within 10 miles of something like 95% of the US population. Like they are incredibly strategically placed to really cover the country. So it wasn't surprising that even though it felt like I was in a very rural location, there was a Walmart not that far away. And so I got there with the modest aim of, some milk and yogurt and other fixings and 2 baby items. But as I recount in direct, it took me maybe an hour, probably 2 hours, or at least an hour and a half by the time I emerged from the store. So I had this huge cart, and I don't think I realized how big it was at the time. And of course, I didn't know where I was going, and they intentionally make it a little hard. So like I'm navigating to try to find my way for this like particular baby rocker that I know I really want. I'm convinced we can reuse. And then I see some onesies, and like I'm like, oh, those are a great deal, and like it'd be a little less laundry while we're out here. And then like I'm like, oh no, we don't really need those. We have hand-me-downs. And so like it's this back and forth throughout the shopping trip. So I both ended up buying far more than I needed, spent a huge amount of time going back and forth, even about things that I ended up not buying. And really by the end ended up with all of these different bags. And I study behavioral economics, right? I know all of the different patterns that skew our decision-making in suboptimal ways. And yet I was like staring at all of the ways I had just fallen in to every single trap. And I was like, wow, like this is like this is what it's like in practice. And of course I do that every day. Like I was on the internet over the weekend. I definitely did some shopping I didn't need to. Some that was helpful and some I didn't need to, but it was one of those concrete moments of just seeing how the accumulated knowledge of what consumers actually do and how that gets translated into the physical and virtual environments in which we now shop and live really shifted the overall dynamic in ways where all these things that feel like they're serving us oftentimes are actually getting us to outcomes that are really suboptimal from where we want to be. And of course, like the intermediaries, the Walmarts and the Amazons make our life a lot easier, but it was a powerful reminder of how their power and the influence also shapes a lot of decisions that I might have been better off without.
Yeah, so here we are on Cyber Monday. We've all been pummeled with promotions all weekend and all week probably, and probably surfing Amazon and Walmart.com aplenty as well. I wonder, how have those particular players helped accelerate the transition to what you call a middleman economy?
Yeah, so my term middleman economy really is not just about middlemen. It's about the combination of these middlemen have gotten much larger, much more complex, and then, the long and complex supply chains behind them. And there have been multiple different mechanisms, some just having to do with economies of scale and efficiency, right? So Walmart buys a heck of a lot of goods. And in the process of buying so many goods and demanding constantly lower prices from its suppliers, it's transformed how goods are made. So we've really seen this kind of through the 2 different stages of globalization. The first stage was just, goods that were made in country A then moved to country B as the cost of transportation got lower. More recently, what we've really seen is a disaggregation kind of the process of production, where it's no longer the goods are being made one place and shipped someplace else, but we're seeing the incredible scale and low prices that Walmart demands makes it seem cost justified to dole out each little step in a production process to the place and the people that can do it most cheaply. And then you can use those both communications innovations to help make it seem a lot cheaper and more smooth. So one example, of course, that I use in the book, or not of course, excuse me, one example I use in the book is really a transformation of two different companies, one called Crown Crafts and Churchill Weavers that it acquired. One was based in Georgia, the other was based in Kentucky. They really bought cotton relatively local and made great textiles. As late as 2000, they employed more than 2,000 people in US manufacturing operations. Today, Crown Crafts claims that it sells 6 baby bibs for every baby born in the United States. So it still sells a huge number of goods and bedding and baby toys. I certainly bought some of the Sassy branded products that they sell. Yet now their workforce is just over 130 people. So
It's
even
remarkable.
Sales have increased. Exactly. And in some ways, we'd still think about them as a maker, right? They're not Walmart that we see. They're not the middleman we see. But really what they're doing is they're doing some design work, but a lot of what they're doing is overcoming the informational challenges and the logistical challenges that bridge goods that are manufactured in China and other places in Asia and bringing them to the United States and then getting them in those Walmart stores and on Amazon. And that's where we can find them and we buy them. And so what we're seeing is that it's not just Amazon and Walmart, but a layer of companies that we think about as being makers really becoming middlemen. And so the process of production has changed.
And you touch on quite a lot in the book about how initially these middlemen often start by bringing some good to the table. And in some cases, they still are bringing some good to the table, right? They help make it possible for us to have, for example, more goods, more selection available to us. And oftentimes we pay less for those goods than we might have 20, 30, 50 years ago. But over time, and I think you lay this out really well, they start to become inefficient or they introduce inefficiencies by virtue of their very existence. Talk about that. How does that work? At what point, is there a certain sort of inflection point where these entities that at one point were bringing value start to introduce inefficiencies?
Yeah, and that is exactly what makes this both so important and so incredibly challenging, is that they're simultaneously doing both very often, right? But the key is that there is a tipping point with power. So just building on the Walmart example, it's not by chance that an entity like Crown Crafts ceased to do as much US manufacturing in that post-2000 period, because of course it was in the early aughts that we also saw China's introduction into the WTO. And so we're seeing things like trade rules. One of the ways that the middlemen have influence is by, the scale that they demand, but they're also changing the rules of the game in ways that change the structures in which they operate. So they're using that through policymaking and through market structure. One of the broad ways that I kind of got interested into like where that tipping point is in finance. So traditionally, the financial literature shows that holding constant a lot of things that affect economic growth, like the education of the local populace and such considerations, having a more developed financial system tends to result in a healthier level of economic growth in subsequent periods of time. And the idea is that finance is oftentimes, effectively overcoming information and logistical challenges. But in doing so, it's helping to put capital in the pockets of the businesses that have the best ideas in ways that really help to funnel growth. But what more recent research showed is there's a certain tipping point where if the financial sector becomes too large relative to the real economy, that actually, as it grows beyond that point, there's actually an inverse in that relationship where the growing size of the financial sector is related to less, lower levels of real economic growth in subsequent periods of time. And so what that really suggests to me is that the financial system is still providing some valuable services, but it's gotten so powerful that it can start to contort the rules in ways that really help to line the pockets of those involved at the expense of those they're helping to connect. And what I do in Direct is I show a bunch of examples of this. And we've seen examples in banking. We've seen examples in the structures of the stock exchange. We've seen examples in the real economy as well in terms of trade. We see examples in real estate. We see examples in a whole variety of different domains where part of what happens over time is all of the things that make intermediaries just so good at what they do. This critical infrastructure that they help to build, the expertise, the relationships, their understanding of the market, their understanding of consumers and what they need, and investors, and the ability to link them, also give them outsized influence that they use to capture a bigger piece of the pie. And that's where we start to see these inefficiencies creeping in as they entrench structures that benefit them, even when technology, for example, could allow more efficient and cheaper ways of allowing those transactions to happen.
And how can that be when we all know that there are laws on the books? There's an entire, antitrust section of the, federal legal code that is supposed to help deal with concentration of economic power. And yet that concentration hasn't abated. In some cases, it's really grown in certain sectors like e-commerce. The problem is it that the laws themselves are not strong enough, or is it that the laws that are on the books just aren't being implemented properly?
So two things on that. One, I do think that right now we're seeing a re-energizing of competition policy, and that's been incredibly healthy and necessary. And a lot of the challenges that I reveal and direct regarding the outsized influence of middlemen can be mitigated and addressed in part through more robust enforcement of antitrust laws. So that's been really powerful and important. That being said, we can never rely on one set of regulatory tools alone to address these issues. And a couple of reasons for that. One is oftentimes regulation itself is the mechanism through which they're achieving outsized power. So one of the examples I spent some time with in the book are real estate agents. And again, real estate agents rose because they provide incredibly great services, particularly before we had the internet, right? They created this database, the MLS, long before you could go online. And so if you're moving to an area, you wanted to figure out how much house can I afford? What are the houses currently for sale? Rather than just going to like the classified ads or driving around a neighborhood, a real estate agent could really help you identify the houses that might suit your needs. The challenge today is the internet should make it so much easier for buyers and sellers to connect. And it really does. But real estate agents, through laws and through other mechanisms, have actually entrenched a structure that really allows them to continue to get about 5% of each real estate transaction. So this is another example of the inefficiencies you're talking about. And for your typical middle-class family, it's housing wealth more than, stocks and bonds. That's their primary source of wealth. So it's a real cost on their ability to tap in to what is very often their most significant nest egg. And just to follow up your point, one of the ways they've done that is they've managed to convince a number of states to adopt laws effectively requiring a full service real estate agent. And they say it's about consumer protection. It's about making sure that people have all the information they need. But as a practical matter, it's about protecting a particular business model.
Yeah, and you talk in the book about how, tooth and nail they have fought to protect that business model, quashing enterprises that made perfect sense in the internet age to make, those fees go down. And that just hasn't happened because there's a lot of lobbying going on. So,
go ahead.
No, please.
No, and just to be fair, the Department of Justice has realized this, right? So we've seen multiple investigations by antitrust authorities, and even a consent decree over a decade ago that was meant to address these dynamics. But this is part of why the book really focuses on intermediation, is in our day-to-day lives, but also from a policymaking perspective. There are a lot of unique dynamics that are at play in understanding kind of the value and the drawbacks of these connectors. And so I think that helps to explain why, policymakers that are focused on competition generally thought they had the right set of tools, and then those tools didn't actually get the outcomes they wanted to.
And you touched on how right now is a really interesting moment to be tracking regulatory policy and implementation. This moment being the Biden administration and some of the people that he's brought into the administration to enforce some of the regulations that are on the books and formulate new ones. I wonder, what is your general feeling about the frameworks that we have been relying upon when it comes to, deciding what regulation is even supposed to be doing and how it's supposed to efficiency and not enough, or has there not been enough focus traditionally on economic power concentration?
So in some ways, all of the above. I mean, I think part of what we're learning right now, part of the reason this conversation has started in competition policy, even though it's clearly slipped into other areas, is that was an area where it was very easy to see that the paradigm that had been dominating how we do policymaking was failing by its own terms. And so you could actually look back and say, look, we allowed a bunch of mergers to go through because they weren't supposed to raise prices. And then guess what? It actually resulted in prices going up. But I do think it's also a more, the rethinking is a sign and a reflection of the need to think more broadly about what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it. So one is the focus is on efficiency. And that clearly is a good thing, but it's only a good thing up to a point. And so I think now one of the issues is efficiency relative to resilience, for example. And we're realizing, starting with the financial system and now for the rest of the economy, that when we created these really intricate structures that made loans more available when times were good and goods a lot cheaper when everything was running smoothly, but that created price increases and sources of fragility during other periods of time. That wasn't the right balance, right? That we actually want to think about balance. And going back to consumer welfare, which is the standard we've used for antitrust, we realize, yes, most of us are consumers, but that's not the only role that we play in this world, right? We also come to the table as workers, as part of a community, as citizens, and that very often, and trying to kind of maximize what we get as consumers, we were also paying a very high price in a lot of the other roles that we play.
Just another quick reminder for our audience, if you have a question, you can ask Kate your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Do it anytime, and we're going to do our best to answer your questions at the end of the program. I want to dive in a little bit deeper with you, Kate, on the trade-offs of living in a middleman economy for both consumers and global workers. We've touched on this a little bit already, but I was really struck by the claim that you put in your book coming from Walmart, which says that it saves each American family $2,500 a year. We have, seemingly infinite selection of goods that we can buy, though we're waiting longer for them to be delivered these days. And yet, these savings are not really translating into a higher quality of life. And I wondered if you could just reflect on that for a moment. What struck you as you were doing your reporting about this disconnect? We're saving dollars, and yet we're kind of, running as hard as we ever have financially.
Yeah, and so a couple of things there. One of the things to note is, so first of all, I should clarify that study wasn't officially done by Walmart. It was done by a third-party research firm. It was funded by Walmart, though. So part of what we see in a lot of domains is the source of the funding can at times seem to influence outcomes. And I think what the story that Walmart was trying to tell, though, is, look, even if you don't shop here, we are forcing, a leaner production process. And that's what leads to cheaper goods. And so that means that even, when the same flour company is selling flour to Kroger and to your local grocer, in addition to selling to Walmart, they're potentially able to do so at a cheaper price because we're helping to spur a more efficient production process. But that gets into the bundle of conversations we were just having, where yes, it might have been more efficient, but maybe that's because they were not paying laborers as well. Or they were really shifting kind of where those jobs were located, or there was effects on the environment that we were systematically blinded to because the supply chain was just so long, we really couldn't understand what the impact was. So oftentimes there were kind of qualitative shifts and other impacts that we're changing, but in ways that were not immediately transparent. But that doesn't mean that those don't potentially also matter. And so going back to the question, which is about the trade-offs, I think one of the challenges we're seeing right now is, for a long time, I think we just assumed, consumers wanted the cheapest good possible, holding kind of what they could know about quality constant. And investors just wanted to maximize those risk-adjusted returns. But now we have trillions of dollars flowing through investments that claim to have some type of benefit on the environment or social or governance factors. And we're seeing consumers not only buy kind of specialized organic or fair trade goods, but a much broader swath of consumers that are saying, look, well, I actually really care about the environment, and I really care about how workers are treated. And I know that policy can't do everything. And the ability to pivot and provide that kind of information is proved incredibly, incredibly difficult. So part of the challenge that we're seeing is it worked well for one set of things, but first of all, there were hidden costs because there was a lot of fragility. And two, as there's a more robust set of values that we're bringing to the table, we're not able to evolve the system very quickly to meet the broader set of value and considerations that a lot of today's consumers, investors, and workers, really are starting to care about.
And how about for global workers? What have been the trade-offs there in this relatively new kind of economy globally that we live in?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's important to note, and really important to be honest about, and times we don't spend enough time on, is that while globalization has tended to accentuate inequality within countries, so we see much greater inequality in the United States now than we did 50 or 60, 70 years ago, it's actually tended to reduce it globally, right? So you might have a worker living on the other side of the globe, or even just, on a different part of the continent that has access to a job that provides them significantly better wages than they'd previously been able to get, even if they're laboring under conditions that are far from what we would allow for US workers. And that's a real conundrum. And one for which there's not an easy answer. The answer is not that we're going to be able to make everything in the United States again. It's neither feasible nor desirable. But there are real trade-offs, because part of what we're also starting to discover is at least some of that labor is under conditions that are not just below what the US would allow for its own workers, but are actually potentially abhorrent to the typical US consumer. So for example, forced labor, we've really started to try to address, for example, the use of Uyghur forced labor, partly because of geopolitical dynamics with China, but forced labor occurs other places as well. And we haven't expunged that by any means from our supply chains. Child labor, also increasingly common at times in goods that we consume every day. I mean, it's one of the hard things for me for Halloween. Like, I love chocolate, and most cocoa is grown in areas that use a meaningful amount of actual child labor. And then overall working conditions, right? I mean, a big factory fire occurs and suddenly we're seeing the realities. Or right now what's happening with Apple in China. I mean, we're suddenly seeing, oh, this is what it actually means to, so we're buying $1,000 iPhone. I mean, it's an incredibly, incredibly expensive device. And personally, if I spend $1,000 on a good, I would like to know that it's ethically manufactured. And I'm learning that that's not the case. And I had no way of knowing that actually when I bought it. So there's this weird trade-off again, where we have choice, we have convenience, we have these incredibly sophisticated goods that are amazing. But if you want to like sleep well at night because you feel like, okay, like the way my actions are impacting the world are generally ethically sound, it's very hard to get that comfort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as all of us learn more about how our goods are produced, we're seeing this gravitation towards more direct exchange, which you make a really strong case for in your book. And I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. First of all, what does it mean to buy direct?
Yeah, I mean, so really direct, I think about this on a spectrum. So we'll start with the extreme, right? And direct really is kind of like, let's actually go to the people and the places that are producing these goods. And the idea is to do it once in a while, just to help to spark that reminder. I mean, one of the real challenges of the middleman economy is we are systematically blinded to the effect that we have on the people and the places who are, helping to produce the clothes that I wear and the food that my family's going to eat for dinner tonight. And so they're so far out of sight and mind that we forget about times about that impact. And direct is the opposite extreme. It's,
Let me stop you there, Kate, for 1 second. Just on the point you made a moment ago, how deliberate do you think that is, that opacity into how our goods get made?
That's such a good question. And I think the reality is it's both. I think that there is some deliberateness about it. And we have lots of really good examples. We were just talking about chocolate, right? So Congress actually got concerned about the impact of child labor on chocolate. And we saw this incredible effort by the largest chocolate makers and their trade group to enter a private agreement where they basically said, look, we're going to do everything we can to eradicate child labor. Like, don't put any public money into providing greater disclosure and accountability, because we'll take care of it privately. And then, research done a decade later shows that actually child labor is probably more rampant than it was. And so I think there is, in part, when you go into, choose your favorite Halloween display or Easter display, there's absolutely nothing, whether it's Walmart or Macy's or, wherever it is that you're choosing to shop, that is going to give you the least bit of understanding of who it was or where it was that was playing a role in this. Like, they want you to feel good about your decision. That being said, I think there is also, like, supply chains have gotten really complex. And actually, at this point, I think a lot of times companies just don't have the information because we didn't require them to have the information. And it's hard for them to get it. And so there's a weird combination of clearly some volitional effort to recognize that consumers and investors are going to do things more easily when they don't have to think about the not so pleasant aspects of their actions, and some reality that even if you want to provide that information, that would have required different types of structures that we now have.
Right. And, I think your experience with a CSA in your own community is a really good example of trying to kind of live what you're writing about a little bit here, a direct-to-consumer experience, which you seemed very happy with, but also one that came with some practical challenges. Can you talk about, your takeaways from taking part in that?
Yeah, I mean, so this was kind of like my own experience, and I'll be honest, we got there a little bit indirectly. We did, like, after the second kid, we're like, all right, we need a little space, and we would love, we were fortunate enough, and it really was a privilege to be able to say, like, let's get a place in the country so we could spend a little more time and have our kids run around. And we just happened to have a next door neighbor whose full-time job was serving as the head farmer of a community-sponsored garden, community-sponsored agriculture. And that is the structure where you have these relatively modest-sized farms, usually, oftentimes quite small, actually, and you pay a fee or a price at the beginning of the season, the growing season, and then you effectively get a pro rata share of whatever they grow that season. And you have to go to the farm, you have to pick it up. It's oftentimes incredibly inconvenient. You don't necessarily get to choose what you want. So our farmer, Mike, he's amazing, but he feels like his duty is to grow anything that will grow in northern New Jersey. So he will grow all kinds of foods. Like, he loves, he does the corn and the tomatoes that Jersey is famous for, and he knows everybody wants. But he also grows a heck of a lot of other things. And so I've had to, like, learn, like, what do I do with garlic scapes? Or like, wow, there's like 3 different types of eggplant here. Like, how do I manage to get my kids to eat more eggplant? And he admits it himself.
I think the answer is you can't, by the way. It's just not happening.
interesting is then the kids come with us, right? And so like they really get to know the farm. And like they know Mike, they know his family, they spend time there, and that has just been so enriching. And so it is this incredible challenge for us to get there. There's this like incredible guilt of like, oh my gosh, like I thought we like we're gonna make it there, and then like we didn't get out of the city in time, we didn't make it there, and I don't want that food to go to waste, and how do I make sure like it doesn't? And then there's just this like smell that I get when I go in the barn, and I suddenly feel like, oh, like this is actual like food, and like this is what I'm not getting, even when I like pay a ridiculous amount to try to go to Whole Foods in terms of the experience. And so it's really kind of like that balance of really trying to spend some time accepting all of the inconveniences, and then really appreciating there's something really distinct and beautiful there. And part of what also happened over time was there's community that started to grow. A lot of the choice and convenience is great because it allows us to be very isolated. We can do everything online, as many of us are doing this weekend. But we realize that sometimes being kind of like forced out of those comfort zones and stretching ourselves is sometimes like just what we need to lead a slightly healthier and more balanced life.
Mm-hmm. So what thoughts do you have on how to scale direct exchange, which is really the fundamental challenge with purchasing goods in that way? What role does technology play, for example?
Yeah, so two things really quickly so there's the scaling question of how we scale direct exchange, and then there's the role of direct exchange. And I think one of the roles of direct exchange is actually to build the political will to help address the structural problems associated with the middleman economy. So it's not that everything should somehow go direct. That's just not going to be the outcomes that are going to serve what our society, our economy needs right now. But part of it is there's a lot of costs of the middleman economy that we don't tend to see. And we engage in a little direct exchange, we're like, oh, wow, like here's what's been lost. And here is what we actually can do a much better job creating, even in an economy that has a lot of middlemen, but where the power shifts in meaningful ways back to creators and back to consumers. But scale is a really interesting point, because one of the joys of technology is either you have big data being used by the largest middlemen to accentuate the amount of power they have, or we see these really great platforms that are arising that allow scale at the level of connection, at that level of intermediation, while still allowing really kind of small scale in production and really individualized decision-making at the point of consumption. So, Etsy early on in its early days was a nice example of this, where we really did see people kind of leaving their day jobs after a time, or developing a hobby that suddenly can be financially self-sustaining. And part of, again, the benefits that we're seeing there are, one, consumers enjoy these handmade, more unique goods, but there was also real joy on the other side of like, oh, wow, there's somebody out there who actually wants my good. And so there was a sense of like something personal that was happening on both sides. And again, I think now it's gotten to a scale, and they've also changed their rules in ways where it can be a little bit more of a mixed bag. But it's a nice example of the way technology can do this. Kickstarter is another great example. You see people giving money, you see people accepting money. Sometimes it's friends and family who but would have been too awkward to ask. And sometimes it's complete strangers. But what's really interesting about these environments is very often there's real meaning and joy for both sides that go beyond the money and the goods that change hands.
Mm-hmm. Meaning and joy, and also, sort of a freedom from this question of, who was the supplier of this particular item, and who are their suppliers, and who are some of the tertiary and so on types of suppliers that, we have so little transparency into as consumers. And I think your book does a really good job of sort of making us ask that question. Where is our stuff coming from, and why don't we know more about the answer to that question? I wonder, you were talking about platforms a minute ago, and sort of trying to tie that to accountability in Amazon's case in particular. Why does it matter to understand that particular company's platform component as we grapple with how powerful Amazon has become?
Yeah, I mean, Amazon was one of those really interesting examples. Clearly, it's one that I use, that almost everybody uses. It's an incredible paper that was actually written when Lena Khan was still a student. Really helped to propel her, and very rightfully, to fame. And yet, I don't think I appreciated just how powerful and distortive it was until I wrote this book.
Mhm.
It was really digging into the incredible details of both how it provides value and how that in turn gives it power. And so this is actually a really nice way of connecting to the point you made earlier of where policymakers gone wrong with antitrust. And one of the core challenges is that it's not about taking a static picture of how much power exists right now, but understanding, well, what are the dynamics that are going to change over time? Where is power likely to accumulate, and where might it kind of naturally diminish? And part of why intermediation is so important is a lot of what is the natural disruptive mechanisms of change don't occur. And second, very often power not only is not disrupted, but it grows. And so if you think about something like Amazon, one of the ways they provide value is by having built out this incredible logistical infrastructure, right? My girls now expect everything to arrive like the next day. Like I now make sure that I'm using not the next day delivery ever, because like it's amazing how quickly we become accustomed to shorter and shorter delivery times, right? And that feels like this incredible convenience to us, but then it shifts the norms for all consumers, even in other environments, for what you have to potentially compete against. And in turn, it also shapes the power that Amazon has over its sellers.
Mhm.
So if you're a buyer on Amazon, it might seem like it hasn't changed that much over the last decade. But there's some really great work being done. Stacy Mitchell for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has been really powerful in this, where she actually looks back kind of every year over the past 8 years and looks at, well, when you pay a price on Amazon and you're buying a product not from Amazon, but one of those third-party sellers, like how much is ending up in Amazon pocket and how much is ending up in the product of the actual seller? And what you see is on average, these are aggregates, the amount that's ending up in Amazon pockets relative to the seller is going up each and every year on average. And part of it, they're charging higher fees, but partly they're creating structures where people want to pay for more Amazon services. So suddenly they feel compelled to pay for delivery by Amazon because that little like prime check is something that they really need to have.
Mhm.
And then suddenly they're operating in a really competitive environment. So they feel the need to pay for prime placement. And that becomes another way that they're paying additional fees. And so part of what we're seeing is there's a gamesmanship happening kind of within Amazon, where they know now that consumers start their searches at Amazon more than any other site when they're shopping online. They know how many people are Prime members, and so do sellers. And so why originally enabled sellers to reach consumers, and it still does, the amount of power that accrues to Amazon as a result of that keeps growing in subsequent years because the cost of opting out get that much higher. Which goes back to why we really need structural solutions, right? So individual opt-outs almost never work. A little bit of individual opting out is really healthy, but when you're dealing with structural problems, what you really need are more structural solutions.
Mhm. And I think you do a really good job also in the book of explaining, these very difficult choices that suppliers end up making. Do I want to, stay in my community and keep hiring hundreds of people here in Kentucky or Georgia, or do I want to stay in business, which means continuing on and even maybe expanding my relationship with a company like Walmart and Amazon? And I thought that was something that was, really thoroughly explored, is just how difficult a choice this is for the companies themselves that find themselves in the middle of this very delicate, very intricate now supply chain.
And for the workers, I mean, so I think it's really hard for leadership originally when they're making these decisions. And then part of what's really interesting, and here again, like Charles Fishman original book on Walmart, but there are a lot of other examples out there when you really dive into the literature of people who really don't feel good about shopping at Amazon or Walmart, but who really don't feel like they have a choice. And Amazon is, I think, where many people experience it today, but Walmart is where a lot of this started. And so you have these powerful examples of workers who lost their jobs because so much manufacturing moved abroad. And so they suddenly are operating on much tighter budgets. And in operating on those much tighter budgets, and in a world where Walmart has made it so there's fewer and fewer smaller local businesses, they feel compelled to do more of their daily shopping at Walmart. And so you have kind of this thing that is not captured in a traditional paradigm of economic like cost and benefits of people who are regularly shopping at a store and in some ways reaping the benefits of the price they pay relative to the quality of the good that they get, but feeling deeply internally conflicted about it, in part because they have personally paid a price or somebody they know has personally paid a price for the indirect ramifications of the demands made by that middleman.
Mm-hmm. Just another reminder that if you in our audience have a question that you want to ask Kate, you can ask it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to do our best to answer as many of them as we can before the end of the program, which is actually coming up in a couple minutes. So get your questions in now. I want to ask you next, Kate, is there any turning back from this economy, this middleman dominated economy that we're in now?
I don't think we want to turn back. I think what we want to do is forge a better path ahead. So one is to just kind of like put up our hands and say like, this is what it is. Let's just give all the power over and really not pay any attention to economic structure. And the other is to say, look, there's actually a bunch of different drawbacks here that we haven't paid sufficient heed to. And that through political will and through structural change, we can actually achieve outcomes that allow better resilience, more accountability, and where there's actually the possibility of some of these intangible benefits, because we know who that money we're paying is going to, in ways that actually could result in a much healthier and more balanced economy. So I don't think that the aim should be kind of to look back to an earlier era and say, oh, that was the ideal. What we really want to do is roll back to what the economy looked like in 1950 or an earlier period of time. But instead to say, look, we've gotten a lot of benefits from this, but there were costs. And there were costs that we didn't fully appreciate along the way. And so it does mean that, prices go up a little bit. Suddenly they're going up a lot because there was a lot we didn't understand about the structure of how the economy worked. And, for the financial crisis is like when things contracted a little, they contracted a lot. There were a lot of fallout. And so it's starting to say like, look, now that we know that there's just so many trade-offs, that maybe there's more of a role to play, either through antitrust, through other regulatory mechanisms, through bottom-up support, going back to Amazon. It's like, let's think about actually like what it might mean if rather than just helping the post office be self-sufficient, we chose to really subsidize the post office and say, we think the post office is an important mechanism through which we can promote healthy competition and allow people to go to small businesses and allow businesses to reach individual consumers and makers to reach individual consumers. So we're going to really subsidize that as a way of facilitating certain types of connections and certain types of businesses. So I think for me, it's less about rolling back and really thinking creatively about how we can harness the benefits of technology, harness what we're learning about ourselves and how the world works to try to rebalance the system.
Mm-hmm. Thanks to all of you in our audience for submitting questions. Keep them coming. We have a couple more minutes to go here. Chris asks, what would it take for Amazon to be structured in a way that addressed many of these issues of a middleman economy? How much is this driven by shareholder capitalism more generally?
So both great questions, and some of this is shareholder capitalism. I teach, corporations, and I spend a lot of time on those dynamics. But Amazon, that's really not the case. It really doesn't actually fit the shareholder capitalism at all, because it was not giving money back to shareholders, and it was never actually for a long time trying to maximize its bottom line. It really was genuinely long-term more focused. Part of what makes Amazon so interesting is Jeff Bezos was like, I'm going to do what I think is best. And that means creating what I think is going to be the most powerful company I could imagine. And so it's actually an interesting example of not doing kind of the stereotypical like short-termism that we associated with shareholder capitalism, but instead saying like, look, I'm willing to run on really, really thin margins, forgo potential gains today, because that's going to benefit the company and eventually shareholders, but many, many, many periods into the future, but in ways where I'm making the investments that are really going to increase the size, scale, scope, and power of the company. I mean, personally, I think we are now at the point for Amazon where even though I think the break them up mentality, which I think I'm sometimes skeptical of, might be the best approach. And I think the idea there is you have Amazon, the seller, and then Amazon, the platform, and figure out, is there a way to actually separate those two, allow them to use a common logistical infrastructure, but actually have them as separate websites. And if we think about kind of right now, Prime being the key to the magical kingdom, figure out a way to kind of like separate off some of the other pieces, because otherwise I think we have to be aware not only just where it is now, but how that power is going to continue to grow and continue to grow potentially in ways that are distortionary and squeezing out alternatives in the future. So I have to admit, when it comes to Amazon, I think trying to ask anybody to individually just like not go there is, helpful, but so far from a realistic solution. And it is an area where we really do need to think potentially aggressively and structurally, and where we might have to have short-term hiccups. And it doesn't mean, foregoing absolutely all of the benefits we have, but we have to understand that oftentimes having the healthier future means slightly, that there are going to be small trade-offs, and accepting at least some of those trade-offs.
Yeah, it's a really great point about Amazon playing the long game and ultimately coming out on top. We also have a question from Jim about cookies and trackers. He's very concerned about the accumulation of those kinds of trackers on his personal computer. And I'm going to use that question actually to pivot a little bit into a question about, how is it that these companies, Amazon, being kind of foremost among them, I would say, how do they use our personal information to actually influence things like their lobbying activities, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's actually the cookies and trackers are really interesting because it is this weird dynamic where they say, look, we're going to get a bunch of information about you, and that's going to help us better serve you. Part of what we've seen with the Europe's effort to better regulate privacy is people actually opt in oftentimes to all of these different things, because when they opt out, it creates a less, smooth browsing experience. But that means that we are giving an incredible, incredible amount of data to those parties that are currently the largest actors in ways that really do accentuate their power in future periods. And so going to your point about policymaking, oftentimes that data not only allows them to contort kind of like their interactions with consumers and the structures and ways that short consumers, but it gives them kind of insight and information that is far in excess of the regulators that are trying to oversee those activities. And so I think that is one of the many sources of power imbalances. And while it's not specific to intermediaries, it certainly is part of it, because again, it's that role of connecting you to a particular source of information that's allowing them to gather that particular type of data, and then to have a potentially distortive effect.
Mm-hmm. Mia asks, how can the structure of supply chains be shifted to a more linear and transparent approach? Would this change come from public policy or corporate decision making? And what are the pros and cons of shorter supply chains?
So I think it has to be both policy and private decisions. I mean, one of the few good things about the supply shocks that we're seeing right now is it's forcing companies to really rethink their supply chains. So first of all, it's a great example of, the corporate decision making is not necessarily going to get to the place that's optimal all the time. I mean, when I started writing this book in kind of January 2020, I was like, supply chains are fragile in ways that people don't realize. And most people, I think, at that point really hadn't fully appreciated it. And now consumer companies are paying attention. But there's a real question over, do they try to kind of patch up the system they have by, now having kind of a multi-sourcing strategy? Or are they thinking more strategically and long-term about, wow, there were upstream risks that we were not attuned to. And there might be other upstream risks that are going to be really important in the future. And so creating shorter chains is really to our long-term advantage, because we now will have a meaningfully better understanding of our risk exposures, of the types of like labor practices or other things that consumers or investors might care about. And so there might be reasons to make those shifts. And so the trade-off is usually the process of transitioning is costly, but and sometimes the new structure can entail more costs because there are usually some efficiency gains from the disaggregation, but it can be far more resilient. And in a regulatory environment where, Germany now wants people to know more about what's going on with their supply chains. There's questions over whether the SEC is going to require companies to tell more about kind of like what is the carbon footprint of their suppliers. Well, you are much better positioned. You now have a significant competitive advantage. So there's really an interplay that we're seeing between both private innovation and public responses that I think is going to be key to getting us to a healthier place.
One more question from Justin. This is a really good one in the sense that I think it really comes to or gets at the heart of what we can all actually do. Reading your book and taking in all this really great and important information, what can consumers do, he asks, to contribute to a healthier competitive economy on the individual level? Personally don't use Amazon and encourage my friends to shop direct and local, but is that actually effective? And he asks, what's the best thing individuals who are concerned about ethical consumption can do? Are there resources to help guide us?
So first of all, thank you, Justin, for everything you're already doing. Those are precisely the types of decisions that we need. And then I think complement it with action. Whenever it's hard for you to go direct, or we are tempted to rely on a really large middleman because it seems like impossible to opt out, well, those are the moments to go beyond trying to figure out like, okay, well, where should I go individually, and think like, oh, there's a little light bulb moment. Like there's a structural problem here. Write to your local congressman, write to your state lawmaker, write to who, and figure out other ways to promote advocacy, because I think that's where we can really start to bring the change. So I think, personal consumption choices play a real role, and the types of decisions you're making are definitely among the types of decisions that we need to promote a more sustainable and accountable system. But it also means when it feels really hard for you, it probably feels really hard for everybody else as well. And trying to activate the levers of policymaking and realizing that you can, not just through your vote, which is absolutely key, but also through your voice, is how we start to bring about this change. And so part of the role of direct is just increasing the awareness to help build that political momentum.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for all the questions, everybody. And Kate, I want to end with you by asking if there's one brief final message you want our audience to take away as we sit here on this Cyber Monday and continue into the holiday season of shopping and beyond. What would it be?
You know what? I mean, just like for dieting, like trying to cut things out is always hard, but it's a lot more fun to add things. And then when you do, you squeeze out some of the bad habits. part of going direct, while it can be an inconvenient, can also be a source of just real joy. And so whether it's like finding a local Christmas craft fair, go cut down your Christmas tree. I know it's not environmentally great, but there's a lot of Christmas farms around me that, Bill, and that's a real fun chance to kind of get out and to understand your community a little better. So find some really fun ways to try to go direct this holiday season.
Start fun. I like that. That's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Kate. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Lily. This has been so much fun.
Totally. To learn more about World Affairs, head to their website, www.worldaffairs.org, where you can find out about upcoming live stream and in-person events, as well as past program recordings, and listen to the radio show and podcast. A special mention of tomorrow's in-person program in San Francisco. It's a hands-on workshop with As You Sow, helping you dig into any 401k or mutual fund investments you may have to understand what companies your money is really supporting, and to identify funds that fit your values while performing well. So that's that. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and we hope to see you at another program again very soon.